we're here for your post-observation conference, and you have your notes, and we're using the Janesville's observation reflection form to kind of guide our discussion today. So, in reflection of the literacy unit that I observed, tell me what went well or what was most successful.
Well, we've been working hard on students questioning, so being able to ask themselves questions about what they're reading, just to make sure that they're understanding the text that they're reading better. Things that I think went well, I had the students working in some smaller groups of 3, and they were asking each other in their small groups the questions that they had actually come up with the day before. So not only were they engaged because they were the questions that they had come up with themselves, so they could feel that they were contributing to that learning, but they were, I feel, a little bit more prepared then to answer those questions. And the questions were based on a nonfiction text that we had worked on throughout the week. It was also a different format, so it was a little bit more novel. I feel like they were more engaged. Because it was new, they were feeling like it was more of a fun thing, but they were also learning at the same time. I also feel that it was successful because after they, in their small groups, asked themselves the different kinds of questions, there were some literal questions, some inferential questions, and then personal questions from the text. Then they were able to have some choice afterwards in answering some questions from each of those categories, and then that was their assessment, their summative assessment from me to see, okay, did they understand? So they had practice with the questions prior to that, and so they were all very successful in answering those. So I feel like those things went well.
So you mentioned the summative assessment.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me, did the students learn what you intended? Were the instructional goals met, or how do you know?
I feel that they were. All students were successful in answering the questions. The other part of that was I wanted them to refer back to the text to answer the questions, and that's where those literal questions came in. They actually had to go back through the text, find those answers, and then, or find where that answer would come from in the text, and then answer those. So my goal was that they were able to refer back to the text, also make some inferences from the things that they had read in the text, think a little bit as well, and I feel like they were successful at doing that.
So if all your instructional goals were met, what'd you do next? What was the next step?
So because that was a nonfiction piece of text, then after that, we worked through those same types of questions with a fiction text, a piece of fiction, to make sure that they could apply the same skills, the same questioning skills to a piece of fiction as well.
Describe one or two things, and I know the makeup of your class, it's a pretty intimate group, but I also coach them, so I know some of their challenges. But describe one or two things that you did during this lesson to help some of those students with unique needs.
Before I had them working in their groups of 3, I did put some thought into which groups of 3 would work well together. There are some students in my class, they don't work the best together, especially with an activity that they were going to be spending quite a bit of time with those other students. I put quite a bit of thought into, okay, who do I need to put in this group of 3 who can work well? So I had already pre-selected my groups, and that was definitely helpful. Having them have the opportunity to look at the questions prior to the activity that you observed or the lesson that you observed, I feel like that set them up for success as well. Some of my students are struggling readers, so the day before they had had a chance to read through those questions, and so they knew what was coming. So I feel like that set several students up for success. I also, this group is quite active. They need to be moving, they need to be hands-on, and so having them look at questioning this way in with partners, with small groups, they were able to move to a spot in the classroom. They weren't sitting at their desks. I feel like that kept them engaged as well. And I had mentioned before it was kind of a newer activity or a new way of learning for them. So I think that also helped them be engaged and learn at the same time.
Yeah, and I don't think the camera was helpful that day as I was walking around. I've watched the video a few times and they're waving at the camera, and I'm sure I didn't help some of those students that need movement. So.
And also me moving around and just redirecting if I was noticing that there were kids, because there were those groups that they were crumpling the questions, they maybe were arguing with their partner, even though I put thought into who they would work best with. So me moving around constantly throughout the activity and redirecting, and then my para was in there at the same time as well, and she's very good at redirecting as well. So those were, I feel like, all things we tried to have in place.
Sure. If you had the opportunity to teach this lesson again to the same group of students, what might you do differently?
One thing, right even as I was going over the directions, I had pulled some questions out of the envelope, and the students the day before had kind of pre-coded which type of question they were asking, so that was right on their strip. And I think one of the first things I pulled out, they had coded incorrectly. Now, the day before when they were coding, I had been moving around, my para had been moving around to help with any of the questions they had. If they didn't know, was this a literal, an inferential, or a personal question? Clearly, we didn't catch all of the ones that they coded incorrectly. So, which was okay, that was kind of a learning, teachable moment as well, because then we could talk through, is this really inferential, is this personal? So taking that little bit of extra time and going back through the envelopes, the questions, making sure that things were coded correctly, one more time I feel like would have been another really good thing to do. That was probably my main thing. I know that kind of jumped out at me right away when I was even introducing the lesson to the students.
Sure. And you identified in your pre-observation conference the Iowa's teaching standards and criteria you were working with, but how were those standards and criteria you identified demonstrated?
This teaching standards.
Teaching standards, yep.
I feel like teaching standard, standard 3, and because that is, I feel like I was showing that I was competent in planning, preparing for instruction, by pre-selecting those groups. The standard that the students were working on was that questioning, being able to refer back to the text, so I feel like I incorporated that. Management, that was also, I feel like, demonstrated. The students always have their clear expectations as to this is how we work in a group, this is how we problem solve if we come up against, we're not agreeing with our partners. So I feel like I demonstrated those.
And I would add standard 5, monitoring student learning. I mean, you were moving about the groups, providing feedback on an ongoing basis.
Yeah.
So no, those are the 3 that I would have identified too. Tell me, can you provide examples of student works related to this lesson? And maybe because there wasn't necessarily work samples, maybe some of the feedback that you provided to students on this assignment, whether it was verbal or written.
After they did their summative assessment, where they were able to choose questions from each of those categories, so they were the same questions that they had practiced asking each other in their small groups. Then I went ahead and I looked those over. They were all very successful at that, being able to answer those questions correctly. And so then after that, and me going through and seeing kind of where those kids were at, were they successful, were they not, when we moved on to the fiction piece and also applying these same types of questions, we had conversations about, okay, last week when you did this with your nonfiction piece, how did we answer those? What were some of those examples? And then I did pull some of the questions back from that summative assessment and say, remember that an example of these inferential questions, read those again, and then we kind of talked about why was that inferential, why was that personal, or why was that literal. and,
And
and actually use student examples of those questions and those answers, so.
And this is a tough question for what you did, because yours
Mhm.
was small group and it wasn't a formal written assignment, so written feedback would have been a little bit of a challenge, which makes this tool somewhat tough in that, we're required to ask this question.
Well, and as they were handing those summative assessments in, there were several students who maybe weren't as detailed in their answers as they could have been. Because a lot of the times with those inferential questions, there's that, okay, explain that a little bit more. It's not just a one word or short phrase answer. You have to do a little bit of thinking and explaining. So there were moments where when they would hand that to me, I would say, can you tell me a little bit more about that, if it wasn't as detailed as it could have been? Or even in their literal questions where the answer was right in the text, can you show me where that answer is in the text? And a lot of times then those kids would say, I'll go back and look and come back and maybe have a little bit of a different answer when they were given that little bit of feedback or reminder that you need a little bit more, or check and show me again where you found that in the text.
Thank you. Thank you for participating too. I know this wasn't completely comfortable. I'll transcribe this and
Okay.
I'll shoot you an email. I know you got to get to class here in just a minute, so
Okay.
thank you again.
Yes, you're welcome.